Chapter 3. The experience of that second night in the house stirred my memory to thoughts of the sinister gloom that had pervaded the house for me as a boy. Gloom which radiated from my great-uncle Uriah's forbidding countenance, and from the locked attic room which no one dared enter, however often my great-uncle went in and out of it. I suppose it was only natural that eventually I would think again of the challenge represented by the attic room, and would respond to it. The rain of yesterday had given way to bright sunlight, which streamed into the house through the windows on the sunny side, and gave to it an air of genteel and mellow age, one far removed from the sinister. It was such a day as to make all that was dark and ominous seem very far away, and I did not hesitate to light a lamp to dispel the darkness in the windowless attic, and set out forthwith for the top of the old house, carrying along all the keys Mr. Saltonstall had surrendered to me. None was necessary, however. The attic room was unlocked. And empty, too, I thought, when I stepped into it, but not quite. A single chair stood in the middle of that gabled room, and on it lay a few prosaic objects and one which could not be so described. Some woman's clothing, and a rubber mask, one of that kind which molds to the features of the wearer. I crossed to it, astonished, and put the lamp down on the floor, the better to examine the things on the chair. They were nothing more than what I had seen at a glance. A common cotton house dress in a very old-fashioned square print design, in various shades of gray, an apron, a pair of skin-tight rubber gloves, elastic stockings, house slippers, and then the mask, which, on examination, proved to be ordinary enough, save for having hair attached to it, however unusual it was to find it here. The clothing could very likely have belonged to great-uncle Uriah's cleaning woman. It would have been like him to let her use only the attic room in which to change. And yet, of course, this did not ring true, considering the care he had always taken to allow no one to enter that room but himself. The mask could not be so readily explained. It was not at all hardening, betokening long disuse. It had the softness and flexibility of rubber that is being used, which was all the more mystifying. Moreover, in common with the rest of the house, the attic was spotless. Leaving the clothing undisturbed, I picked up the lamp again and held it high. It was then that I saw the shadow, which lay beyond my own, against the wall and sloping ceiling, a monstrous, misshapen, blackened area, as if some vast flame had flared forth and burnt its image into the wood there. I stared at it for some time before I realized that, however grotesque it was, it bore a resemblance to a distorted human figure, though its head, for it had a surmounting blob of shapelessness that served as its head, was horribly out of shape. I walked over to examine it, but its outlines faded as I drew close. Yet, undeniably, it had the appearance of having been burned into wood by some searing blast. I moved back again, toward the chair, and a trifle beyond it. The shadow bore the appearance of having come from a blast of flame virtually at floor level. Its angle was odd and inexplicable. I turned, accordingly, and tried to find the possible point from which whatever had made this strange blemish on the wall and ceiling could have come. As I turned, the light fell upon the opposite side of the attic room and disclosed, at the point I sought, an opening at the juncture of the roof and the floor, for there was, along this side of the house, no wall between floor and roof. An opening no longer than that for a mouse, and I assumed instantly that it was, indeed, a mouse-hole, and it did not attract my attention for more than a second, but what was painted in garish red chalk or oil all around it did, a sequence of curious angular lines, which seemed to me completely unlike any geometrical designs with which I was familiar, and which were arranged in such a fashion as to make the mouse-hole seem their precise center. I thought instantly of my great-uncle's absorption in witchcraft, but no, these were not the familiar pentagrams and tetrahedrons and circles associated with sorcery, rather their opposite. I carried the lamp toward the painted lines and examined them. Up close they were simply lines, no more. But from the middle of the attic they had a strange kind of design, essentially other-dimensional, I thought. There was no telling how long they had been there, but they did not seem to be of recent origin, that is, within the last 3 decades or so, and they might very well have been a century old. It was while I was pondering the meaning of the strange shadow in the painted lines opposite it that I began to grow aware a kind of tension in the attic. It was actually indescribable. It felt, how curious it is to put it into words, as if the attic were holding its breath. I began to grow uneasy, as if not the attic but I were under observation, and the flame on the wick wavered and began to smoke, and the room seemed to grow dark. There was a moment that was as if the earth had taken half a turn backward or something of that kind, and I had not gone along with it, but were suspended somewhere far out in space at the instant before plunging into an orbit of my own. And then the moment passed. The earth resumed its regularity of turning. The room lightened. The flame in the lamp steadied. I left the attic in unseemly haste, with all the whispered lore of my childhood pressing after me out of the store of memories. I wiped away from my temples the fine beading of perspiration which had gathered there, blew out the lamp, and started down the narrow stairs, considerably shaken, though by the time I reached the ground floor I had regained my composure. Nevertheless, I was now a little less ready than I had been to brush aside my fiancée's perturbation about the house in which I had consented to spend the summer. I pride myself on being a methodical man. In her lighter moments, Rhoda has referred to me as her little pedant, referring strictly, of course, to my concern with books and writers and the circumstances of literature. Not that I mind. The truth, no matter how it is put, is no less truth. Once recovered from my momentarily frightening experience in the attic, following so hard upon the events of the night, I resolved to get to the bottom of the matter and uncover some tenable explanation for what had happened in both instances. Had I, in fact, been in a hallucinatory state on both occasions, or had I not? The cleaning woman, obviously, was the nearest point of departure. An immediate telephone call to Mr. Saltonstall, however, only confirmed what he had said before. He knew of no cleaning woman. He had no knowledge that my great-uncle had ever employed a housekeeper of any kind, and to the best of his knowledge, there was no other key to the house. "But you do understand, Mr. Duncan," finished Mr. Saltonstall, "that your great-uncle was a reclusive sort of man, secretive almost to the point of fanaticism. What he did not wish others to know, others did not know. But, if I may make a suggestion, why not make inquiry among the neighbors? I've set foot in the house only once or twice, and they've had it under daily observation for years. There isn't much, you know, that neighbors don't find out." I thanked him, and rang off. Approaching the neighbors, however, apart from a frontal attack, represented a problem, for most of the houses in the area were at more than lot-line distances from my great-uncle's house. The nearest house was 2 lots away, off to the left of my great-uncle's ancient house. I had noticed very little sign of life about it, but now that I peered from the windows, I saw someone in a rocking chair, taking the sun on the porch of that house. I pondered for a few minutes about my best approach, but I could think of nothing but a direct question. So I walked out of the house and down the lane to the house next door. As I turned into the yard, I saw that the occupant of the chair was an old man. "Good morning, sir," I greeted him. "I wonder if you could help me." The old man stirred. "Who are you?" I identified myself, which aroused an immediate responsive interest. "Duncan, eh? Never heard the old man mention you. But then, I never spoke with him more'n a dozen times. What can I do for you?" "I'm trying to find out how to reach my great-uncle's cleaning woman." He gave me a sharp glance out of suddenly narrowed eyes. "Young fellow, I'd like to have known that myself, just out of curiosity," he said. "I never knew her to have any other place." "You've seen her come?" "Never. Saw her through the windows at night." "You've seen her leave, then?" "Never saw her come, never saw her leave. Neither did anybody else. Never saw her by day, either. Maybe the old man kept her there, but I wouldn't know where." I was baffled. I thought briefly that the old man was being deliberately obstructive, but no, his sincerity was self-evident. I hardly knew what to say. "That's not the only thing, Duncan. You seen the blue light yet?" "No." "You heard anything you couldn't explain?" I hesitated. The old man grinned. I thought so. Old Garrison was up to something. I wouldn't be surprised if he's still at it. My great-uncle died last March, I reminded him. You can't prove it by me, he said. Oh, I saw a coffin carried out of that house up to the cemetery on Hangman's Hill, but that's as much as I know about it. I don't know who or what was in the coffin. The old fellow went on in this vein until it was clear to me that he knew nothing, no matter how much he suspected. He gave me hints and innuendos, but nothing tangible. And the sum of what he hinted was little more than what I had known myself, that my great-uncle kept to himself, that he was engaged in some hellish business, and that he was better dead than alive, if in fact he were dead. He had concluded also that there was something wrong with my great-uncle's house. He did concede that, left alone, he did not trouble the neighbors. And he had been left strictly alone ever since old Mrs. Barton had gone to his house and upbraided him for keeping a woman there, and was found dead of a heart attack next morning at her home, scared to death, they said. There was plainly no shortcut to information about my great-uncle to be had. Unlike the subject of my doctoral dissertation, there were no references in libraries, other than my great-uncle's own, to which I repaired at once, only to find there an almost solid array of books, both ancient and modern, on the subject of sorcery and witchcraft and allied superstitions. The Malleus Maleficarum, for example, and very old books by Olaus Magnus, Eunapeus, De Rocas, and others. Few titles meant anything to me. I had never heard of Ananias De Natura Demonium, or De Vignates Quaestio de la Mise, or Stampa's Fuga Satanae. It was evident that my great-uncle had read his books, for they were marked up with annotations, principally cross-references jotted down for his easy use. I had no difficulty reading the often ancient printing, but it was all on related themes. My great-uncle's interest ran not only to the ordinary practices of witchcraft and demonology, but to a persistent fascination with succubi, the retention of the essence from one existence to another, not apparently a reference to reincarnation, familiars, the wreaking of vengeance by means of sorcery, incantations, and the like. I had no intention of studying the books, but I took time to follow some of his references on the essence, and found myself led from book to book from a discussion of the essence, or soul, or life force, as it was variously called, through chapters on transmigration and possession, to a dissertation on taking over a new body by driving out the life force within and substituting one's own essence, the sort of rigmarole which might conceivably have appealed to an aging man on the threshold of death. I was still at work among the books when Rhoda called from Boston. Boston! I was astonished. You didn't get very far. No, she said. I just began to think about your great-uncle and stopped here at the Widener to look at some of their rare books. Not on sorcery, I hazarded a guess. Yes, Adam. I think you ought to get out of that house. And just throw a tidy little inheritance over my shoulder? Not a chance. Please don't be stubborn. I've been doing some research. I know what a closed mind you have, but believe me, she said earnestly. Your uncle was up to no good when he made that stipulation. He wants you there for a definite reason. Are you all right, Adam? Perfectly. Has anything happened? I told her in detail what had taken place. She listened in silence. When I had finished, she said again, I think you ought to leave, Adam. As she spoke, I was conscious of a growing irritation with her. Her possessiveness, her assumption of the right to tell me what I ought to do, which did, certainly, postulate her conviction of knowing better than I what served my welfare, angered me. I'm staying, Rhoda, I said. Don't you see, Adam? That shadow in the attic. Some monstrous thing came in by way of that hole and blasted that shadow there, she said. I'm afraid I laughed. I've always said women simply aren't rational creatures. Adam, this isn't a man-woman thing. I'm scared. Come back, I said. I'll protect you. Resigned, she rang off.